Everyday injustice. Too many wrongful convictions. Corruption has infected the criminal justice system, leaving too many people helpless, fighting for their lives. Instead of receiving justice, people suffer. Is that why they say justice is blind?
So I'll just briefly introduce what we're going to be talking about for anyone who's going to be watching. So a consortium of civil rights organizations, legal organizations, and a law firm filed an extraordinary writ petition with the Supreme Court of California, challenging the state's death penalty statute. The organizations that filed the petition are the Legal Defense Fund, the ACLU Capital Punishment Project, ACLU NorCal, the Wilmer Hale Law Firm, and the Office of the State Public Defender. And the challenge was brought on behalf of the Office of the State Public Defender, Witness to Innocence, LatinoJustice PRLDEF, the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and Eva Paterson, the co-founder of Equal Justice Society. So the petition challenges the death penalty by arguing that it is racially discriminatory and therefore unconstitutional under the Equal Protection Clause of the California Constitution. And we wanted to hold this webinar to give the public a little bit more information about the petition and to discuss some of the reasons behind why your organizations filed it and what sort of effects and impacts you think it will have. So we'd love to hear a little bit about our speakers. Lisa, if you want to just introduce yourself briefly.
Yeah, hello, thank you for inviting me. My name is Lisa Romo, and I work at the Office of the State Public Defender in our Oakland office. So for the last 2 years, I've been assigned to our Indigent Defense Improvement Division, where I've been working on issues relating to the California Racial Justice Act. But before that, I was representing people who had been sentenced to death for over 3 decades. So I have long seen these racial biases that we're challenging in action in my cases. And we've finally gotten to the point where we can challenge them. So I'm really happy to be here. Thanks.
Avi?
Sure. Thanks also for the invitation and for getting information out about this important petition. I'm Avi Fry. I'm an attorney with the ACLU of Northern California's Criminal Justice Program. We are also co-counsel on this petition. The ACLU of Northern California has been involved in death penalty advocacy, both through litigation and through policy work for a long time. We have also been heavily involved in the creation of and now trying to enforce the Racial Justice Act. Our office is both trying to help collect data for individual folks who are incarcerated or have been convicted to use in their own cases. We are bringing our own Racial Justice Act challenge for an individual who is convicted and sentenced to death. But we recognize the limitations of the Racial Justice Act, in part because of the enormous amount of work that goes into bringing an individual claim. And so we were very excited by the opportunity to bring this claim on behalf of everyone who's on death row, everyone going forward who might potentially be subject to a capital prosecution, to call out what everyone has long known and what the facts make irrefutable, that application of the death penalty in California is racially biased. So happy to be here, very excited to talk about this challenge.
Morgan?
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Morgan Zamora, she, her pronouns. I'm the prison advocacy coordinator at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, and we're joining as a petitioner in this litigation. So the Ella Baker Center is based in Oakland, California, and we work to advance racial and economic justice to ensure dignity and opportunity for low-income people and people of color. And we really do that through policy advocacy and organizing work, in particular for incarcerated communities. We run a prison mail program where we're in communication with over 10,000 individuals who are currently incarcerated in the state of California, including many of the people who are condemned in the state of California. And we also work on pathways to freedom, including policy and implementation work around the state's resentencing laws, including the California Racial Justice Act. And we're also a very proud member of the California Anti-Death Penalty Coalition, and really excited and grateful to be here today and to be part of this really important litigation.
Karen?
Hi, I'm also happy to be here. Thank you so much. I may be the only person not local to California. My name is Karen Munoz Trevino. She, her pronouns also. I am a Justice Catalyst Fellow at LatinoJustice PRLDEF, so we're petitioners in this case. Latino Justice has been working for 50 years around equality for Latinx people in this country. Our criminal justice pillar is newer than 50 years old, but our work related to the death penalty specifically, so I'll speak a little bit to Texas first, has for individuals looked like advocacy for the most part, so on the ground advocacy, organizing around Melissa Lucio's case, Rodney Reed's case, and other individuals. And organizationally more broad than that, we've filed briefs in support of people in Arizona and California that are on death row, or that were sentenced to death. And also at the federal level, that advocacy has looked like asking the Department of Justice to not sentence Patrick Crucis to death, and asking President Biden to follow through on his promise to not use the death penalty anymore. Thank you.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you so much for those introductions. So now we'll just dive into the questions, and like Sophie said earlier, feel free to answer them in whatever panelist order you wish. So first off, and I know you guys all just touched on this in your introductions, but you're all part of these amazing organizations that work to fight for civil rights and justice for everyone. So if you guys don't mind just expanding on a little bit more on how does eradicating the death penalty and its racial bias sort of fit into your organization's missions?
I can go first if that's helpful. So this particular challenge to the death penalty is at the intersection of sort of two pillars of the work that we do at the ACLU of Northern California. One is race equity work. That is a central theme of the work that we do across projects. We have a number of issue areas, and race equity is at the forefront of a lot of what we're involved with in our immigration work, in our work on behalf of LGBTQ folks. We have a racial and economic justice project. And so we are very attuned to the ways that implicit bias and systemic structural racism impact institutions and keep cycles of disadvantage ongoing. And that's certainly at play here. Our petition in this case spells out not only statistically why it's so clearly established that race impacts application of the death penalty, but also the various sort of turning points in the life of a criminal investigation, prosecution, trial, and sentencing at which discretion enters into play, and implicit bias and structural racism put a thumb on the scales and time after time result in a more likely charge or sentence to death for folks of color. So race equity certainly is at the forefront of our work. It's also, our criminal justice team at the ACLU of Northern California takes a dramatically different approach to the death penalty and to much of our criminal legal system in terms of how we respond to the problem of offending. Our view is that criminal offending is a societal problem. It is the culmination of a number of things that go very wrong, and that a retributive or deterrence-based approach to punishment is not effective, and it fails to account for the dignity of individuals, and it comes with all kinds of societal costs, not only the costs of incarceration, the cost of numerous trials and appeals to try and execute someone, but also the social and economic costs of taking folks out of their communities, removing them from their families, and effectively giving up on people. And so that's obviously a broader goal than just taking on capital punishment, but capital punishment as the most extreme form of retribution-based punishment is certainly something that we oppose. And so sort of this case is at the merger of those two sets of issues that we care deeply about.
I can go next. So our position at State Public Defender is a little bit different. We're not an advocacy organization. We represent people on death row. We have for decades. We get involved once someone is sentenced to death. They have what's called an automatic appeal that goes directly to the California Supreme Court. And so we represent our clients at that level. And then that person also has the right to habeas corpus investigation and counsel. We have done that in the past. We're not currently doing that. So our involvement in this case is really about representing our clients. So it's about recognizing that racial bias, as Avi said, both explicit, implicit, and also structural, pervades the system. And we are in a place where we realize we don't have the ability to effectively raise this claim individually in our clients' cases. The post-conviction system, once someone is sentenced to death, the direct appeal and the habeas system is extraordinarily slow and dysfunctional, basically. And so by the time, if we were to put this information that we included in the petition in one of our cases at the trial level, it would take decades, 30, 40 years before the California Supreme Court ever saw it. So this is really the only viable way we have of vindicating all of our clients' rights to racially to trials free of racial bias. So that's how we're involved in this case.
I can jump in. And I think the Ella Baker Center is in a little bit of a different position since we aren't a legal services organization and we don't directly represent individuals, but we do feel that in a lot of ways we represent the interests of the incarcerated community since we're so deeply connected to them and really committed to supporting people inside in all of the various pathways to freedom. Including advocacy for universal clemency and including, our role in this litigation. And we see the work to end the death penalty as just another one of those pathways to liberation. One of our main values at the Ella Baker Center is the prioritization of people of color most impacted by prisons and policing. And above all else, our work prioritizes freedom. At the end of the day, that's what we aim for, is to free everyone who's currently incarcerated and to meet the material needs of the communities that we know are most harmed, that we know need access to resources and information and opportunities to actually regain their lives and the lives of their families and their communities. And we prioritize their leadership, their healing and their liberation and all that we do. We rely on them to give us the okay in everything that we do, even in joining as a petitioner. Here, we asked people that we know who are inside and who have loved ones that are condemned and who are currently serving life without parole sentences. We asked for their permission and their understanding and their insight into how they felt about this and how they thought that we should move when it came to deciding to join this litigation. And, we're really excited to be at this point and, to try to dismantle parts of the system that we know continue to harm communities of color, and particularly communities of color with low or no income, to create a world that is freer and has fewer people in cages. And we, again, have not represented individuals, but we have been really big proponents of the California Racial Justice Act and have been co-sponsors of every iteration of the law thus far and continue to work on policy and implementation and hear and see the need to address the bias and the racial discrimination that still continues to be incredibly prevalent within our system.
So I'm not sure that I have anything to add because you all are so great. I do want to say that, So we're an abolitionist organization. So even beyond the death penalty, we believe that prisons and policing should be abolished. And that's because we believe inherently that no human is disposable. I think the most clear example of a belief at all that humans are disposable is the death penalty. And it's not surprising, of course, that the same racial disparities that exist across society exist in the implementation of the death penalty or the application of it. So yeah, I think too, it's important for us. We do, have a CJ pillar and we do work around the issue, of course. And, but also we don't necessarily view the death penalty as a criminal justice issue. We view it explicitly as a moral issue or an immoral issue, of course. And I think it's important to use that framing. It's almost limiting to see it as a criminal justice issue because so many people think it doesn't apply to them if it is only a CJ issue. I think, I mentioned at the introduction that we wrote a letter to the department, or our president signed a letter to the Department of Justice asking that the DOJ not seek the death penalty against the person who targeted the El Paso, Texas community. And that's a difficult thing to do, right? But I think it's important to share that because our stance is unconditional, right? We don't believe that it should exist at all.
Yeah, thank you for answering that question and for all of you for expanding on the work that your organizations do and what those missions are. So our next question, in each of your opinions, what is the most damning evidence that proves that the death penalty is racially biased?
You can start us off. To me, it's not any individual piece of evidence. It's really the accumulation. It's the body of evidence. In our petition, we have presented over 15 studies that cover 44 years of death sentencing in California. These studies were conducted by a variety of academic experts using different data sets, different methodologies, but they all show disparities both in victim race and a defendant race and at varying points in the death penalty process. So I think it's just we've reached the point where there isn't any more doubt. I mean, this evidence is just overwhelming, and it's also supported by a lot of social science that has investigated the individual points within the death penalty system. So, for example, we know that because of the particular way that jury selection occurs only in capital cases, we end up with juries that are not racially diverse, not racially and ethnically diverse, and with jurors who are more prone to both conviction and to sentence a defendant to death, often by relying on negative racial stereotypes.
I'm glad that Lisa also couldn't pick one piece of evidence because I think, I had the same sentiment that it's everything that has been pulled together, right? It's all of the facts and having them laid out and on display for people to see in a way that you really can't argue against, right? You're looking at numbers, you're looking at statistics, right? There are hundreds of individual stories that you can look at and see what happened, but to have it laid out in front of you in a way that is clear that you can't argue against or say that it's just one individual person's experience. This is a systemic issue, and it's an issue that has persisted for a really long time and continues to persist, right? I think people with the moratorium, there's a sense that this isn't happening anymore, and people tend to forget about this as an issue, but people are still being sentenced to death every year in the state of California. And 80% of the individuals who have been sentenced to death since the moratorium began in 2019 have been Black or Latino individuals. And I think that we can't continue to ignore this information. And now it's really, through all of the work of the people who have conducted these studies and all of the brilliant lawyers that have put together this litigation and have been working on it, we're able to really see that incredibly clearly.
I can jump in. I would agree that all of the evidence points in the same direction. I think the question of, what's sort of the strongest piece of evidence is respectfully maybe not the right question. I don't think there is actually reasonable dispute that the death penalty is racially biased in its application in California. The volume of studies that are mutually reinforcing over a long period of time simply shows as a factual matter that there's racial bias. I think the question is, what are we going to do about it, if anything? Whether the state will stand for it, whether the judiciary will stand for it in our particular case. And also, I mean, part of the point of bringing this case is, this is not something that's happening over there. This is not something that someone else is doing. This is our government. This is the state of California. It is doing this in our name. Is that something that we want to be a part of? Do we support that? So I think the question is really, what will we do with this evidence now that it's incontrovertibly clear and we're trying to make it known to everyone in the state? This is an ongoing problem. So I think that's really the question that we're trying to force people to grapple with. It's an uncomfortable one. It requires dismantling apparatus. It requires dismantling assumptions. Some people have preferences, in the abstract about the death penalty or the moral question that Karen raised. That's really not what we're talking about. And so, are we prepared to look the facts squarely in the eye and take action? I think that's really sort of the issue that we're trying to bring to the fore.
Well, thank you so much for those responses. I guess moving on, so all of your organizations have come together, obviously, to file this writ petition in the California Supreme Court. And this is amazing. This petition is the first of its kind. So I guess we're all just kind of curious, what comes next? Sort of, do you see this petition being replicated in other states or on the national level? And is there another strategy that you would pursue if the petition perhaps failed?
Well, I can take on what comes next. So the initial briefing is done. The Attorney General has weighed in and has basically agreed that there are very troubling disparities or evidence of troubling disparities, and the court should take this up. And so we are hoping that we've also had some amazing petitions, amicus petitions in support, former justices and judges who have explained the need for the court to take up this issue, not to express any opinion one way or the other on the legal issue, but to ask the court to resolve this very important question. The same with prosecutors, a prosecutors group, and also legislators, and I'll let some of the other speakers talk about that. But we are hoping the next stage is an order from the California Supreme Court saying, okay, let's hear your evidence. So we are hoping that we will get an evidentiary hearing where we get to present all of this evidence. And we are hoping that that will be before somebody that the court appoints as a special master, is what it's called in the California Penal Code. So we are hoping we can get this evidence in front of the court, and then after the fact findings are made, that we can then argue our legal claim in front of the Cal Supremes. But I will let the other panelists talk a little bit about strategy and other issues.
I can try to pick that up. And I think I mentioned already, there are so many different pathways to freedom. And it just takes the actors in the system to support them and to allow them to work in order for the people who are most affected and that are currently incarcerated to use them. At least within the Anti-Death Penalty Coalition, there will be, regardless of whether the Supreme Court chooses to review this petition and continue, we'll still be pushing for universal clemency, which is different, right? Ultimately, it would have a similar goal, but would just function a little bit differently. And that would just be the governor of the state of California also has the power at any point in time to grant clemency to the individuals who are currently sentenced to death in the state, and to provide them a different sentence rather than just granting them clemency on the individual factors of their case, right? The governor has the power to say that death penalty cases across the board are an injustice and can take action to vacate them in a sense. And there are other governors throughout the United States that have used their universal clemency power before to provide relief to people who have been sentenced to death within the state. So, you know, as much hope as I think we have as petitioners in this litigation, there are always other people and other actors that are working and pushing for relief for this community in a variety of different ways, and will also always be continuing to support the implementation of the Racial Justice Act and to try to make the law as functional as possible and to support its use as a really vital tool for individual cases, for those who are currently condemned in the state, as well as for those who aren't, to be able to challenge the racism and bias in their convictions and the things that they have experienced on a more individual level, or just in particular in their county. But I do think that we have a lot of hope, and there is a lot of anxious excitement from people inside as well to see how this turns out and how the Supreme Court responds.
The only thing I have to add is same. We are similarly very excited that this works out, and even if it doesn't, until the death penalty is eradicated in the country, our work, whether that's advocacy, whether that's litigation, whether that's organizing, will continue.
I would only add, we're also committed to the principles behind this litigation and making sure that folks are not languishing on death row, or other folks are not charged with capital offenses. But I want to point out, there is not this is kind of it in terms of the comprehensive level of relief that is actually possible. It is not possible by other means. Universal clemency would certainly liberate the hundreds of folks on death row now. It would do nothing with regard to the death penalty statute, or it would not prevent any of the ongoing capital prosecutions, or death row could be restocked, so to speak. Legislation, or voter initiative, or a constitutional amendment, certainly we hope to educate the public, but those have proved intractable paths previously. That's the whole of the government. So then, statewide comprehensive relief is sort of off the table, and then we're talking about pursuing remedies in individual cases. That is not going well in California. There are not sufficient attorneys to bring their existing constitutional claims in challenging their death penalties, let alone under the Racial Justice Act, which, I mentioned this a very little bit at the outset. It's hard to overstate the amount of person hours it requires to investigate and plead and then prosecute your Racial Justice Act claims. You must prepare to bring a Racial Justice Act claim that's not based on the transcript, but based on statistical evidence. The sorts of studies that we cite in the petition, localized to your county and with comparators to your individual offense. And I'm drilling down a little bit here just to show how complex and expensive and difficult it is to marshal that kind of evidence. I will say that in the particular case that we're working on, the county does not digitize its records, which is not unusual in California, which means you need many people, either paid or on a volunteer basis, to go to the courthouse on a regular basis, pull records, and then sort through hundreds of page stacks to find the pertinent information to know, did this person commit an offense that's similar to your client? And can you determine the race of the defendant and the victim in this case from the file, or do you need additional sources? It's incredibly time consuming, and that's for one case. And there are hundreds of folks in this circumstance. So it's just a fact that the RJA will not permit the sort of relief that we're trying to obtain here, and which the facts show is well justified. I mean, race is a factor in all of these cases. So I mentioned all of that to say, we're certainly committed to carrying the fight forward. There isn't another chance as good as this.
Okay, so I wanted to touch on public opinion a little bit. According to a Pew Research study, 64% of the public feel that the death penalty is morally justified in certain cases, but public support has also been shown to waver depending on how you frame your question. So we also found a Gallup poll in 2023 that recorded that only 47% of people think that the death penalty is applied fairly, which is the lowest recorded number for that question. So we wanted to ask, how has public support been for this initiative? And why do you think that support for the death penalty has been dropping in recent years?
I can start here. I think that there is a strong intuitive pull when terrible things happen to feel outrage, and that giving voice to that outrage in the form of support to harsh punishment is something that feels reasonable to folks. That's a very different thing. Well, first of all, let me say this. Anger is usually, I think, what I or other folks feel when they don't understand the cause. When you know why something happened, it doesn't take away the pain or the trauma of something bad happening, but the outrage that comes from confusion and not understanding, I think that can be diminished, and that often you can see someone who does something bad as a human being again when you know how they got to that place. Even putting that aside, I think the way that folks feel about capital punishment in the abstract is very different from what folks are learning about capital punishment as it's applied. This is a very broken system. We don't live in a world in which we're able to meaningfully determine which offenses are worse than others, whose culpability is greater than someone else's. These are discretionary decisions, totally subjective, without any real way to measure. And as a result, all of our prejudices come into play, and race prejudice is certainly strongly among them. What we've seen in modern times is true in California, and Karen, I'm sure you see this in Texas, is the death penalty has become hyper-localized. It's really about DAs. Which DAs like the death penalty? Which counties are used to the death penalty? I only know what I read in the news, but my understanding is Texas has a humming death penalty that's based on effectively 2 counties. California similarly concentrates its death penalty in a couple of particular counties. And so I think some of the statistical evidence is a little misleading because about voter preferences, because I think when voters are asked, just as you phrased the question, when they're asked after a question about whether they think a life for a life makes sense, many will say yes. But how many want a death penalty, and how many want their local prosecutor to be seeking death? It's much less, and it tends to be concentrated in particular locations. So I don't think it's fair to say that the majority of people wants capital punishment in their name. And the last thing that I'll say is, this is beside the point. We are seeking a remedy in a court. Courts are not democratic bodies, and that's by design. The point is not that they're supposed to do popular justice, but that they're supposed to do justice, especially when it's unpopular. And so I think sort of looking at what voters tend to do is something for legislators and for the governor. But the court should be guided by the facts and the constitutional principles of the case.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say, I don't know that we know what kind of public support we have for this litigation. We haven't really delved into that. But what we're hoping is that this litigation will educate our voters and our citizens, both about the racial inequities in the death penalty, but also the other inequities of the death penalty. This is a system that's severely broken. But it's costing taxpayers millions and millions of dollars to keep on the books. So the death penalty trials are extraordinarily expensive. Death penalty appeals and post-conviction work is extraordinarily expensive. So taxpayers are still paying for that, and I'm not sure people understand that. And so I think because we haven't had executions recently, people aren't thinking about the actualities, like Avi is explaining, of the death penalty. They're thinking about it in the abstract. And so I hope that this litigation gets people thinking more critically about the death penalty as a punishment, as a system in this state. And although we are focusing on the racial disparities, and that's what this litigation is about, I'm hoping it prompts a deeper thinking about whether California should have a punishment like this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a difficult question, this question. I think it's fair to assume that for whatever changes in public perception of the death penalty exist, I think it's in large part due to social movements, or, when in the individual cases that do get a lot of media support, a lot of public appearance, then I think that allows people to then think critically more about it, right? I think that this petition exists and that we're here talking about it also helps expand the conversation, right? So again, I'm making assumptions that that's what has moved public perception, but I think that often is what moves public perception, is the space for, this petition allows even the opportunity to continue discussing and for more people to see that the death penalty is not fair in a lot of ways.
And I think, I think within California and even outside of California, there's this perception of this being a very liberal state that has certain opinions and people aren't monolithic, and a lot of people are very unaware. I think, in a lot of ways, like Avi and Lisa were stating, like it is such a county by county issue, and it's such an individualized issue in terms of how people feel about it. And I think how people feel about what is going on in the world is very dependent on their access to information, right? Even with the California Racial Justice Act, it wasn't a law that was easy to get passed, right? The only reason that it passed in the first place was because of the outrage that people had on what was happening in 2020 and the racism and violence that were really brutally displayed, especially by the actors in our criminal legal system. And I think, it's really important even bringing this. And I think that, regardless of what the outcome is, and regardless of what people's opinions are currently or going forward, it forces them to really view the injustices that are happening. And I think that visibility really causes a reckoning with how we approach and whether we accept or choose not to accept state violence, and how people's minds and perceptions are made up. And I think just, even having access to this information and having it put in front of them, right? The state isn't currently executing people. And I think that that makes a big difference. And if, we were ever in a place where that was happening again, I think, people's opinions really drastically change based off of what information is placed in front of them. So I think even, just the idea that through technology and access and media coverage and knowledge, we're able to disseminate this information more broadly and widely than we would be able to otherwise. And this is really a vehicle for that, right? We're able to show people what is happening and why we need to stop it.
Okay, amazing. Thank you so much for those responses. So I guess before we open the floor for like any questions, I think the one final question that we had was just in terms of Governor Newsom acknowledging that the death penalty is racially biased and filing a moratorium against it in 2019. Although like people have obviously continued to be sentenced to death, no capital punishments have been carried out since 2006. So I guess we're just kind of wondering, why did you file this petition now, and sort of like what has been that timeline and why has it taken so long?
Well, I'll start us off once again. It's taken so long because these studies are really, really intensive, time-consuming, expensive. The experts who conduct these kinds of studies spend years and years. The most recent study that is being published currently that shows, for example, that Black people are 8 times as likely to get death penalty as similarly situated white people. The data collection for that started at least 15 years ago. I mean, this was an incredibly time-consuming process. So why now? I think it's because we finally amassed a critical body of evidence that no one can dispute. And we struggled with it. We struggled for the last few years. We struggled whether do we have enough? Do we need to keep going? And I know a lot of people have asked if there's a moratorium, why bother? And for us, our clients are really impacted by being under a sentence of death. It is impactful even though they aren't facing imminent execution, because executions could resume, but they're treated a certain way because they're sentenced to death. And also, I think as the other panelists have said, that some of the counties especially are still churning out new death sentences. And so we need to stop that, in my opinion, stop racially additional death sentences that are impacted by race.
I can't speak to the timeline of, the litigation being filed, but I think I can also just speak to the need that people have that are on the inside for this type of relief. And, we receive hundreds of letters every week. And a lot of times, a majority of them are just asking if there's anything that we can do to challenge these types of extreme sentences and the way that they impact, the individuals who are sentenced to them, who are condemned, or who are sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, or who receive sentences of hundreds of years for whatever actions have taken place and whatever crimes they've been convicted of. And I think that it's just really important to address that and to ask, why we have these types of extreme sentences, and to challenge the basis on which they're applied, and to question why particular communities are more disparately impacted by them. And I think, even in the time that this was filed, the day that this was filed, we received a message from someone whose husband is currently condemned in the state of California, just thanking us for that, and telling us that when she told her husband what happened, everyone was like cheering on the tears. And I think that that's really important and powerful.
Okay, thank you so much. I guess now we'll open up kind of the floor for any questions that any of our audience members might have. Oh, we have one question. What can we do at the local level to bring awareness?
I can start. I love the question. I think there's a lot that folks can do, and I'm glad that somebody asked, because I think it feels like something like capital punishment and the structural influence of race are such big and far away issues. How can I sort of make an impact and reach that? The first thing that I would say is give your time and money. Give your time and money to organizations that are in the fight. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. There are organizations out there like the Ella Baker Center, like LatinoJustice, like the ACLU that are already doing work. You can't donate or give to OSPD, their state agency, but you can certainly give to a number of nonprofit organizations that readily accept volunteers and are donation-based. You can take political action, any of the sorts of political action that individuals can take by themselves or in community. There are chapters, for example, of the ACLU that are local and based in particular counties. You can, on an individual basis or in coalitions, lobby some of the people who speak on your behalf in government. You can vote in elections. You can vote in local elections. You can raise awareness about these issues by writing to your local newspaper. You can talk about this socially. Let people know that you attended this panel, that you're aware of this petition. These informal networks are also an important way to spread information and encourage people to educate themselves. So I would say, if this is something that lights a fire under you, and I hope that it does, keep it going, and don't be discouraged by the fact that we're all just one person, and you can only make the impact that you can. But through collective action and organization and persistent, diligent effort, hopefully we can do big things. So I appreciate the question.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I think the only thing I would add is I think people who don't regularly go to the courtroom or courthouses in any county here would be really surprised to see any court proceeding. A lot of court proceedings you'd be surprised to see. So court watching programs is, I think, what is another opportunity. We talked about at the county level, these decisions are made, right? District attorneys are able to make decisions, and if we're not there to see them or order the transcript later, there's no headline about it, then I think witnessing things ourselves, and anybody in the community anywhere can do that, right? I think that's really important.
Just echoing, what Avi and Karen have said already. And I think, reaching out to the organizations within your community, reaching out to your legislators, reaching out to any of the decision makers in your local community is really important. And especially if you don't know where to start, just continuing to educate yourself about what is going on, to listen to conversations like this, to read about the litigation itself, to reach out to the Ella Baker Center or different community organizations throughout your state that hold a lot of the knowledge and are able to connect you to the other organizations and the places that need your support, that need your help, and that can share their calls to action with you so that you can actually support and do something that is really needed and really necessary.
I'll just quickly add that our coalition is working on some social media materials, and so share when we have it ready for you. We just hope you'll share it with your friends, your family, your neighbors, your community-based organizations, and let them know what we're up to.
Okay, awesome. And then I just had kind of a quick final question. So I know a lot of you guys talked about today how we're kind of like living in this broken criminal justice system with the possibility of capital punishment. So I'm just kind of curious for members of the public who may want to see some sort of accountability, etc. How would you kind of say you guys are working towards reworking the criminal justice system, and for people who are wondering what the alternative for the death penalty is in terms of life without parole, what are your kind of responses to that?
I think that that's a really big question, and there are especially the first part, there are countless ways that I think each of us as individuals in our roles and within our organizations are working to challenge those. When it comes to the life without the possibility of parole sentence, and the understanding that if this argument is successful, the likely outcome would be that those who are currently condemned would be resentenced to life without the possibility of parole. I, can't speak for everyone else, but the Ella Baker Center also understands and believes very fully that that is an extreme sentence, and we never want to take action that further legitimizes any type of excessive sentencing, and that, this litigation, at least for us, is a continuation of our fight for racial justice, and it's a step towards challenging all forms of state violence and punishment, right? If this is successful, this is a step forward, and this is a step toward relief for everyone, right? I think, even a lot of people on the inside have asked us, what is the difference between these two? And, like Avi had mentioned earlier, it's hard to understand the difference when, you're not actually seeing the results play out because of the moratorium and the way that California's public opinion is around the death penalty currently, right? But if there were executions actively happening in the state, you would see the difference in how that's playing out. And, we're really committed to both the movement to end the death penalty and to also end life without the possibility of parole. And there are so many different ways that we are working to create pathways for individuals from both of those communities. And it's through this work, it's through work with the Anti-Death Penalty Coalition, it's through our membership as part of the Drop LWOP Coalition, and the continued push for the passage of certain laws, including SB 94, which would potentially provide relief to some individuals who are serving life without the possibility of parole if it's passed through the state legislature. And I think, there's countless ways that each of us is working through policy and legislation, or, I can't speak for other people, but even, through the courts in different cases, and supporting or, opposing certain decisions. And I think it takes all of those different efforts to try to change the systems that we're in. And it really just takes people listening and understanding and wanting to learn and hear from the people who are most directly impacted, to hear what they need and what they want, and how the laws that we currently have in the state and how they are applied is affecting them.
Thanks for that, Morgan. That helps me get going. This is a really big question, but I think if people are paying attention, they deserve to know what we really think, what our organization's position is. So I'll try to lay that out. We think that life without the possibility of parole is also an insane, unconstitutional, and inhumane way to treat people. It is barbaric, it is totally needless, and it is based on a sort of politics that we reject. We would like to see a politics of empathy. This is very unsatisfying for some folks, but by starting with the question of accountability for criminal offenses, you miss that, crime is a product of a number of different factors, and it's not a given that it will always exist at the same rate. I've heard the analogy of an animal balloon. If you squeeze off the appendages of, education, access to housing, early childhood development resources, mental health resources, substance use resources, you're going to see a bigger, a spike in the section of the balloon that relates to crime. And so you can reduce crime by taking better care of people and raising the floor for everyone. That's part of what we mean by a politics of empathy. Okay, putting that aside, if you want to focus on what do we do with folks who commit criminal offenses, you try to understand why they committed criminal offenses, and then you try to offer what rehabilitative services you can. That's our position, and it's really as simple as that. Some people do need a timeout. Some people have had a lot of trauma, and they have perhaps some unresolved mental health issues or some substance use issues, and they need some help. And they may be unsafe for a limited period of time to live in their community. Prison and jail, as they exist today, are an absolutely insane way, in our view, to try and treat or assist folks in these sorts of circumstances. In all but an extremely small number of cases, folks can, we believe, remain in their communities and be safe with the proper assistance and resources. In extremely limited circumstances, some kind of civil commitment may be necessary for a limited period of time. I don't want to overemphasize that point because it's extremely limited. In almost all cases, we can provide the sort of wraparound services to people if we care. And that's really what I think it comes down to. Do we care enough about people who live differently from us, people who have different backgrounds, to sort of put ourselves in their shoes and provide the resources necessary? And sort of the last thing I'll say about this point is, I think sort of the politics of retribution, it comes from not being able to imagine how people do some of the things that they do, because people do terrible things sometimes. But the old adage that hurt people is very true. People don't want to kill someone. They really don't. It's the worst thing that ever happened in their lives as well. And I mean that, I don't mean any insensitivity towards surviving family members or victims of violent crime, but it is a tragedy in everyone's life when an act of violence happens, and it's the culmination of a number of really traumatic and bad things in the perpetrator's life. And so that person needs assistance. And also, if we're applying a moral framing of those of us who haven't had those same sets of experiences, it's going to seem outrageous and our anger is going to seem justified, but it's actually a mismatch. It doesn't fit the circumstances that that person has gone through. And it's a poor fit for what that person needs to sort of get back on track and be a productive member of society again. So all of that to say, our view is we don't want the death penalty. We also don't want life without parole. I mean, if I'm representing a client and those are our two options, we'll always take life without parole, but that doesn't mean we think it's a legitimate form of punishment. We advocate for a completely different system, and one that would treat people with dignity, try to keep them in their homes and in their communities, and offer the sort of services necessary to undo past harms, societal failings, and help them get back on the right track.
I want to add that from our perspective, we are not an advocacy organization, so I can't say that we oppose LWOP or any particular sentence. We represent our clients and we ask for just outcomes for them. But what I do want to offer is an observation that in the last decade or so, I've seen a number of reforms to the criminal legal system that are unlike anything I've ever seen, and I've been practicing a very long time. For decades, it only got worse and worse and worse. And now that's changing, and it's changing because community-based organizations are out there and mobilizing. So I present a lot of trainings on the Racial Justice Act, and I have a slide in a PowerPoint show that lists all of the organizations that co-sponsored and supported the Racial Justice Act. And I need 3 slides to do that in very tiny print. There were a lot of organizations coming together to make that happen. And the same is true for any number of reforms. I'm in a very privileged position because our agency gets to, in the IDID side of it, gets to work on implementing these reforms that are so needed. So I'm not in a position where I can advocate for the reform, at least not in my professional capacity as an attorney at OSPD. But I just want people out there to know that you have an immense amount of power to reform the system by asking your legislator, your assembly member, your senator, whoever, to adopt reasonable, much more reasonable criminal legal policies. So if you are opposed to life without parole, you can advocate to change that.
Well, thank you all. I think we're just about out of time. So that is going to conclude our webinar for today. This has been an incredible conversation. I just want to thank our panelists for coming and sharing their thoughts and their insights into this petition. We're very excited about it and we'll be following its progress closely. So thank you so much for being here. This has been awesome.
Thank you to George Powell and Norman Mousequake Barrett for the use of our opening, Everyday Injustice. You can see more of George's music at www.justiceforgeorgepowell.com.